For more than 2,000 years, travelers crossed seas and deserts just to see a building that no longer exists. They wrote about endless columns of shining marble, a sanctuary so vast that many believed no temple on earth could rival it. Yet today, if you stand where this wonder once rose above the ancient city of Ephesus, you will find almost nothing, just fragments of stone and a quiet marsh where one of humanity's greatest monuments once stood. A structure celebrated across the ancient world, admired by historians and poets, and counted among the Seven Wonders, has nearly vanished from the landscape of history itself. So the question is not only how magnificent the Temple of Artemis once was, but why this particular temple, among countless others, earned a place among the greatest wonders of the ancient world. Long before the Temple of Artemis became one of the most celebrated structures of the ancient world, the land where it would stand was already a place shaped by geography, trade, and belief. The site lay near the western coast of Anatolia, close to the mouth of the Cayster River, where fertile plains opened toward the Aegean Sea. Here stood the ancient city of Ephesus, a settlement that gradually grew into one of the most important urban centers of the eastern Mediterranean. Its location mattered enormously. Ships arriving from across the Aegean could reach its harbor, while roads connected the city with inland regions of Anatolia. Over time, merchants, travelers, and settlers from many cultures passed through its gates. This constant movement of people and goods helped Ephesus become not only a prosperous trading city, but also a meeting place of traditions, languages, and religious ideas. Archaeological research suggests that the area around Ephesus had been inhabited for many centuries before the Great Temple was ever imagined. Early communities in western Anatolia worshipped local deities connected to fertility, nature, and the cycles of life. These beliefs were common in many ancient societies where agriculture depended heavily on seasonal rhythms. The fertile lands surrounding the Cayster River Valley made such beliefs especially meaningful. Farmers relied on the soil, the rains, and the stability of the natural world. It is therefore not surprising that early religious practices in the region often centered on powerful female divinities associated with growth, protection, and fertility. Long before the arrival of Greek settlers, shrines dedicated to such deities likely existed in the region. Evidence for early sacred activity near the later temple site comes from archaeological layers discovered beneath the ruins. Excavations have revealed traces of earlier sanctuaries dating back to at least the early 1st millennium BCE. These early places of worship were modest compared to the monumental structures that would appear later, yet they established an important pattern. The location itself had become sacred. Over generations, people returned to the same ground to honor their gods, leaving offerings and building new structures upon the remains of older ones. In the centuries that followed, Greek settlers arrived along the coast of Anatolia during a period historians often describe as the Greek colonization of the eastern Aegean. Cities such as Ephesus became part of the wider Greek cultural world while still maintaining connections with local Anatolian traditions. This blending of influences created a unique cultural environment. Greek language and customs spread through the region, yet older religious ideas did not disappear. Instead, they gradually merged with the beliefs of the new settlers. Within this cultural mixture, the goddess Artemis took on a special role. In the Greek world, Artemis was known as a goddess of the hunt, the wilderness, and the protection of young life. However, the Artemis, worshipped in Ephesus, developed a very different character. Scholars studying ancient texts and surviving statues have noted that the Ephesian version of the goddess carried strong features associated with earlier Anatolian fertility deities. Her image, preserved in Roman copies of earlier cult statues, shows a figure adorned with symbolic forms often interpreted as representing fertility, abundance, or cosmic order. This distinctive form of Artemis became deeply tied to the identity of the city itself. For the people of Ephesus, the goddess was not simply a mythological figure described in Greek stories. She was the divine guardian of the city, the protector of its people, and the center of its most important religious traditions. Temples in the ancient world were rarely built suddenly or without long preparation. They usually emerged from centuries of worship at the same sacred sites. The future Temple of Artemis would follow this same pattern. The great wonder, admired by later travelers, did not appear out of nowhere. It grew slowly from a long history of devotion, local tradition, and cultural exchange that had already made the site one of the most important sacred places in Western Anatolia. Understanding this earlier world is essential for answering the question at the center of our story. The Temple of Artemis did not become a wonder simply because of its size or beauty. Its importance was rooted in generations of belief that transformed a simple sacred ground into the spiritual heart of an entire region. As Ephesus continued to grow, its importance was shaped not only by religion, but also by its position within the wider networks of the ancient world. By the early 1st millennium BCE, the city had become one of the key settlements along the coast of Western Anatolia. Ships traveling across the Aegean Sea could reach its harbor, while caravans moving through the inland valleys of Anatolia often passed nearby. This steady movement of merchants and travelers brought wealth to the city, but it also carried stories, customs, and religious traditions from many distant places. Over time, Ephesus became a place where cultures met and blended. Greek settlers, local Anatolian populations, and traders from across the eastern Mediterranean all contributed to the city's identity. In many ancient societies, prosperity often strengthened religious life rather than replacing it. Wealthy cities tended to build larger temples, sponsor festivals, and support priesthoods that organized rituals and maintained sacred spaces. Ephesus followed this pattern. As the city expanded, the sanctuary dedicated to Artemis became increasingly important, not only as a place of worship, but also as a symbol of the city's unity and prestige. Historical sources suggest that the sanctuary already attracted visitors from outside the region, even before the Great Marble Temple was constructed. Pilgrims came to honor the goddess, offer gifts, and seek divine protection. These visits helped the sanctuary grow in reputation across the surrounding lands. In the ancient Mediterranean, pilgrimage sites often played a role similar to both religious centers and gathering places for trade. Travelers arriving to worship might also buy goods, exchange news, or establish commercial relationships. This connection between religion and commerce was common throughout the Greek world. Sanctuaries such as Delphi, Olympia, and Delos all became places where spiritual devotion and human activity intersected. The sanctuary of Artemis at Ephesus gradually developed a similar reputation. Archaeological evidence suggests that offerings left by worshippers accumulated at the site over many generations. These offerings included objects made from bronze, precious metals, and finely crafted ceramics. Each object represented a personal act of devotion, yet together they formed a visible record of the sanctuary's growing importance. For the people of Ephesus, such offerings also reinforced the belief that the goddess protected the prosperity of the city. Religious festivals held in honor of Artemis further strengthened this connection between the goddess and the life of the community. Ancient festivals often combined religious ceremonies with processions, music, athletic competitions, and communal gatherings. While the exact details of early Ephesian festivals are not fully preserved, historical comparisons with other Greek sanctuaries suggest that these celebrations likely drew participants from surrounding regions. During these events, the sanctuary would have been filled with visitors arriving to honor the goddess, bringing with them stories of distant places and news from the wider world. As the sanctuary gained recognition, its structures slowly expanded. Early temples were often built from materials such as wood and mud brick, which did not survive well over long periods of time. Over centuries, these early buildings were replaced or rebuilt, sometimes becoming gradually larger and more elaborate. Excavations conducted in the 19th and 20th centuries uncovered traces of these earlier phases beneath the remains of the later marble temple. These discoveries confirmed that the famous Temple of Artemis was only the final stage in a long sequence of sacred architecture at the site. Each generation contributed something new to the sanctuary, whether by repairing older buildings, expanding the grounds, or dedicating valuable offerings to the goddess. Through this slow accumulation of devotion and construction, the sanctuary of Artemis became deeply woven into the identity of the city. The goddess was no longer simply a figure of myth, but the spiritual center of Ephesian life. When travelers approached the city, they already knew that this was the home of a powerful sanctuary. The reputation of Artemis at Ephesus spread gradually across the Mediterranean world, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and storytellers. Long before the monumental temple was conceived, the site had already become a place of great significance. The later decision to build a structure of extraordinary size and beauty did not emerge from ambition alone. It was the result of centuries of belief, prosperity, and cultural exchange that had slowly elevated the sanctuary into one of the most respected religious sites of the ancient world. Understanding this development helps explain why the people of Ephesus eventually chose to build something far greater than an ordinary temple. By the time the great project began, the sanctuary of Artemis had already become the heart of the city's identity and a destination known far beyond its walls. By the middle of the first millennium BCE, the sanctuary of Artemis at Ephesus had already become far more than a local place of worship. Generations of devotion had transformed the site into one of the most respected sacred locations in Western Anatolia. Pilgrims continued to arrive, merchants traveled through the city, and the reputation of the goddess slowly spread across the wider Greek world. Yet, the physical structures standing at the sanctuary were still modest compared with the monumental temples that would later define the ancient landscape of the Mediterranean. Early temples were often constructed from materials such as wood, clay, and limestone. These buildings served their religious purpose, but they were not designed to endure for centuries or to impress distant travelers. Over time, however, the growing wealth of Ephesus and the increasing importance of the sanctuary began to change the ambitions of the city's leaders. The 6th century BCE was a period of transformation throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Many cities were becoming wealthier through trade, and rulers sought ways to display their power and cultural influence. Monumental architecture was one of the most visible ways to achieve this. Large temples, public buildings, and sanctuaries demonstrated both religious devotion and civic pride. For Ephesus, the sanctuary of Artemis represented the most important symbol of the city's identity. It was therefore natural that the people of the city would eventually imagine rebuilding their sacred space on a much grander scale. Historical sources indicate that the decisive moment came during the reign of Croesus, the powerful king of Lydia. Croesus ruled a kingdom that controlled much of western Anatolia during the 6th century BCE. Ancient writers such as Herodotus describe him as a ruler of immense wealth, so wealthy that his name later became associated with great fortune in Greek literature. Croesus maintained influence over several Greek cities along the coast, including Ephesus. Rather than ruling these cities with constant military force, he often supported their religious and cultural institutions. In the case of Ephesus, this support took the form of financial backing for the construction of a new and extraordinary temple dedicated to Artemis. Archaeological discoveries at the site confirm that Croesus contributed richly decorated column bases and other elements to the sanctuary. Inscriptions found on some of these columns even record his name, providing rare physical evidence of royal patronage in the project. This involvement was significant. Royal support meant that the temple could be constructed on a scale that might otherwise have been impossible for the city alone. The plan that began to take shape was unlike anything previously attempted at the sanctuary. Instead of rebuilding the temple using traditional materials, the architects proposed constructing the entire structure from marble. At the time, marble architecture on such a scale was extremely rare. Marble was difficult to quarry, transport, and shape, requiring skilled labor and enormous resources. Choosing this material immediately signaled that the new temple would be something exceptional. Ancient writers later credited the design of the temple to architects named Chersiphron and his son Metagenes. While details about their lives remain limited, These names appear in several classical sources describing the construction of the temple. Their work involved not only designing the structure, but also solving difficult engineering challenges. The sanctuary stood on low, marshy ground near the river plain. Modern researchers believe that the builders intentionally selected this soft ground to help absorb the impact of earthquakes, which were not uncommon in the region. According to ancient descriptions, layers of charcoal and fleeces were placed beneath parts of the foundation to stabilize the structure. Although historians continue to debate the exact methods used, the evidence suggests that the builders carefully considered how to protect such a massive building from natural instability. As plans progressed, the scale of the project became clear. The proposed temple would be far larger than earlier buildings at the site. It would contain rows of towering columns, wide open spaces for worshippers, and elaborate sculptural decorations. The sanctuary that had slowly grown over centuries was now preparing for a transformation that would change its appearance forever. For the people of Ephesus, the project represented more than a construction effort. It was a statement about the importance of their goddess and the status of their city within the ancient world. What began as a sacred clearing visited by generations of worshippers was about to become one of the most ambitious architectural projects of its time. When people in the ancient Greek world spoke about Artemis, they often imagined a very specific goddess. In Greek mythology, she was known as the daughter of Zeus and Leto, the twin sister of Apollo, and a guardian of wild places. Ancient poets described her moving quietly through forests and mountains, carrying a bow, accompanied by animals and nymphs. She was associated with the hunt, with the moon, and with the protection of young life. This image of Artemis appeared frequently in Greek literature, especially in works attributed to poets such as Homer and later writers of classical mythology. Yet the Artemis worshipped in the city of Ephesus was not quite the same goddess described in these stories. Visitors who traveled to the sanctuary at Ephesus during the classical and Roman periods quickly noticed that the image of the goddess there looked very different from the Artemis known elsewhere in Greece. Instead of the slender hunter carrying a bow, the Ephesian goddess appeared in a rigid, frontal pose, richly decorated with symbolic ornaments. Ancient statues and later Roman copies show a figure covered with rows of rounded forms across the chest, elaborate garments, and decorative animals carved into the body of the statue. Historians and archaeologists have long studied this unusual image, and while interpretations vary, most scholars agree that it reflects a blending of Greek mythology with much older religious traditions from Anatolia. Long before Greek settlers arrived along the coast of western Anatolia, the region had its own powerful female deities connected to fertility, protection, and the natural cycles of life. These deities were often associated with abundance, the earth, and the survival of communities that depended on agriculture. Over centuries, as Greek culture spread into the area, local beliefs did not simply disappear. Instead, they merged with Greek religious ideas. The goddess worshipped at Ephesus gradually came to be identified with Artemis, even though her appearance and symbolism still carried clear traces of these earlier traditions. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Excavations around the sanctuary have uncovered objects and artistic styles that reflect influences from Anatolian cultures as well as Greek craftsmanship. This mixture suggests that the cult of Artemis at Ephesus evolved slowly over time rather than appearing suddenly with the arrival of Greek settlers. The temple therefore honored a goddess who represented both Greek mythology and older regional beliefs. For the people of Ephesus, this made the goddess especially powerful. She was not simply one deity among many in the Greek pantheon. She was the divine protector of their city, a figure deeply connected to their land, their history, and their identity as a community. Ancient writers occasionally commented on the unusual importance of Artemis at Ephesus. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing during the early Roman period, described the sanctuary as one of the most famous religious centers in the region. Pilgrims traveled there, not only from nearby cities but also from distant parts of the Mediterranean world. Many came to see the sacred statue of the goddess itself, which was believed to possess special religious significance. The statue was housed within the temple and was treated as the central focus of ritual life at the sanctuary. Religious ceremonies performed in honor of Artemis reinforced this connection between the goddess and the people of the city. Priests and priestesses maintained the sacred traditions, while festivals celebrated the presence of the goddess within the community. Although exact details of early rituals remain limited, inscriptions and historical references suggest that these ceremonies involved processions, offerings, and public gatherings that drew large crowds. Such events strengthened the reputation of the sanctuary and ensured that the cult of Artemis remained central to Ephesian society. Over time, the image of the goddess became inseparable from the identity of the city itself. Coins minted in Ephesus often displayed symbols associated with Artemis, showing how closely the goddess was tied to the civic pride of its inhabitants. Travelers approaching the city would already know that they were entering the home of one of the most revered sanctuaries in the ancient world. This powerful religious devotion played an important role in explaining why the temple dedicated to Artemis eventually became so extraordinary in scale. The greatness of the building was not only the result of architecture or engineering, it was also the expression of a community's deep belief in the presence and protection of their goddess. One of the most distinctive features of the cult of Artemis at Ephesus was the statue that represented the goddess inside her sanctuary. In many Greek temples, statues of the gods were designed to reflect the stories told in mythology. Sculptors often portrayed the deities in lifelike forms, showing them as powerful but recognizable human figures. Artemis, for example, was usually depicted as a young woman carrying a bow, sometimes accompanied by a deer or other animals of the forest. These familiar images appeared in temples and artworks across the Greek world. The statue venerated in Ephesus, however, followed a very different tradition. Ancient descriptions and surviving copies made during the Roman period reveal a figure that appears far more symbolic than naturalistic. The Ephesian Artemis stands upright with arms extended slightly outward, her body covered by a long, richly decorated garment. Across the front of the statue are rows of rounded forms that have long attracted the attention of historians and archaeologists. For centuries, scholars have debated exactly what these shapes represent. One early interpretation suggested that they symbolized multiple breasts, representing the goddess as a universal mother and a source of nourishment and fertility. Other researchers have proposed different explanations, suggesting they may represent ritual objects, decorative elements, or symbolic offerings associated with the cult. Although the precise meaning remains debated, most scholars agree that the design reflects the idea of abundance and life-giving power. The statue also displays numerous carved animals and intricate patterns along its body. Lions, bulls, and other creatures appear in the decorative elements of the figure, suggesting a connection between the goddess and the natural world. These images reinforce the belief that Artemis of Ephesus was not merely a protector of the wilderness, but a guardian of life itself. The combination of human form, symbolic shapes, and animal imagery created an icon that was unlike any other representation of Artemis in the Greek world. This uniqueness made the sanctuary at Ephesus especially important to pilgrims. Travelers arriving at the temple expected to encounter something they could not see anywhere else. Ancient sources suggest that the statue itself was believed to be extremely old and sacred. Some traditions even claim that it had fallen from the heavens, a story that may have been intended to emphasize the divine origin of the cult. Whether taken literally or symbolically, such stories strengthened the belief that the statue was more than a work of human craftsmanship. It was considered the living focus of the goddess's presence in the temple. Because of this belief, rituals at the sanctuary often centered around the care and display of the sacred image. Priests and priestesses were responsible for maintaining the statue, preparing it for ceremonies, and ensuring that offerings from worshippers were properly presented. During important festivals, the image of the goddess may have been carried in processions or displayed to large gatherings of pilgrims. These public rituals allowed visitors to witness the sacred symbol of the goddess directly, strengthening their connection to the sanctuary. Offerings dedicated to Artemis frequently reflected the hopes and concerns of the people who visited her temple. Some travelers offered small statues or crafted objects, while others presented valuable items made of precious metals. Archaeologists working at the site have uncovered numerous objects that likely served as votive offerings, showing how individuals expressed gratitude or sought the protection of the goddess. Such offerings accumulated over time, gradually filling the sanctuary with evidence of devotion from many generations of worshippers. The presence of the sacred statue also influenced the architecture of the temple itself. Unlike buildings designed purely for public gatherings, ancient temples were primarily constructed as houses for the gods. The inner chamber, known as the cella, was where the statue of the deity was placed. Worshippers typically performed rituals outside the temple, while the statue remained within the sacred interior space. In Ephesus, this arrangement meant that the entire monumental structure was built to honor and protect the image of Artemis. The temple's size and beauty therefore reflected the importance of the goddess it sheltered. As the fame of the sanctuary spread across the Mediterranean, the statue of Artemis became one of the most recognized religious images of the ancient world. Even people who had never visited Ephesus knew of the goddess and the extraordinary temple that housed her. The statue stood at the center of this reputation, symbolizing the identity of the city and the devotion of its people. Understanding the meaning and significance of this sacred image helps explain why the temple built to honor it would eventually be regarded as one of the greatest wonders of the ancient world. The influence of Artemis in Ephesus extended far beyond the walls of her sanctuary. For the people of the city, the goddess was not only a religious figure, but also a presence woven into the rhythms of daily life. In many ancient Greek cities, a patron deity was believed to watch over the community, offering protection and stability in a world often shaped by uncertainty. In Ephesus, Artemis filled this role in a particularly powerful way. Her temple stood as the spiritual center of the city, but her influence reached into its streets, markets, and public spaces. Evidence of this connection can be seen in the objects the people of Ephesus produced and used. Coins, minted by the city, frequently displayed images associated with Artemis, including stylized representations of the goddess herself or symbols linked to her cult. In the ancient world, coins were more than tools for trade. They were also messages about identity and authority. By placing the image of Artemis on its currency, Ephesus publicly declared the importance of the goddess to anyone who handled these coins, whether they lived nearby or traveled from distant lands. The cult of Artemis also shaped the civic institutions of the city. Inscriptions discovered in the ruins of Ephesus mention officials, priests, and priestesses who were responsible for maintaining the sanctuary and organizing ceremonies in honor of the goddess. These individuals held respected positions within society, and their responsibilities extended beyond religious rituals. They helped coordinate festivals, manage offerings, and ensure that the traditions associated with the sanctuary continued from one generation to the next. Such roles demonstrate how closely religion and civic life were connected in the ancient city. Festivals dedicated to Artemis likely formed some of the most important events in the Ephesian calendar. While the exact details of early celebrations are not fully preserved in surviving records, historical comparisons with other Greek festivals provide clues about their nature. Large religious gatherings often involved processions that moved through the city toward the sanctuary, carrying offerings or symbolic objects linked to the deity. Musicians, dancers, and participants, dressed in ceremonial clothing, would accompany these processions, creating a spectacle that combined devotion with communal celebration. For many inhabitants of Ephesus, such festivals were moments when the presence of the goddess felt especially close. Pilgrims arriving from outside the city added another dimension to these celebrations. Visitors traveled long distances to honor Artemis, bringing offerings and participating in rituals at the sanctuary. Their presence transformed the city into a gathering place for people from many regions of the Mediterranean world. Merchants might arrive alongside worshippers, selling goods to travelers and exchanging products from distant lands. In this way, the cult of Artemis helped sustain both the spiritual and economic vitality of Ephesus. The sanctuary itself also functioned as a place of refuge in certain circumstances. In several ancient cultures, temples were regarded as sacred spaces where individuals could seek protection. Historical references suggest that the sanctuary of Artemis at Ephesus sometimes served this role, providing temporary safety for those who sought the protection of the goddess. Such traditions reinforced the idea that Artemis was not only a distant divine figure, but an active guardian of the community. Over time, the devotion of the Ephesian people to their goddess became widely known across the ancient world. Travelers and writers described the city as the home of one of the most revered sanctuaries in the region. This reputation strengthened the bond between the city and its temple. The people of Ephesus believed that the greatness of their sanctuary reflected the favor of the goddess, while the fame of the goddess enhanced the prestige of the city itself. Through festivals, public symbols, and the continuous flow of pilgrims, the cult of Artemis shaped the character of Ephesus in ways that went far beyond religious practice alone. The temple that would later astonish visitors as one of the seven wonders did not stand apart from this life. It emerged directly from a society that had spent generations honoring a goddess they believed protected their city and their future. By the 6th century BCE, the sanctuary of Artemis at Ephesus had already existed for generations, but the world around it was beginning to change. Across the eastern Mediterranean, cities were growing wealthier through trade, agriculture, and expanding connections with distant regions. In this environment, rulers and communities increasingly expressed their power and devotion through large public building projects. Temples in particular became symbols not only of religious faith but also of civic pride. A grand sanctuary could show visitors that a city possessed both wealth and divine favor. In Ephesus, the importance of Artemis had been building for centuries, and the time eventually came when the city and its patrons began to imagine a temple unlike anything that had stood there before. This moment was closely connected with the rise of the Lydian kingdom, which dominated much of western Anatolia during the 6th century BCE. The ruler most often associated with the history of the temple is Croesus, the king of Lydia. Ancient writers, especially the historian Herodotus, described Croesus as one of the wealthiest rulers of his time. His kingdom controlled important trade routes and fertile lands, allowing him to accumulate enormous resources. Because Lydia held power over several Greek cities along the coast of Anatolia, Croesus developed relationships with these communities that were sometimes political and sometimes religious. Rather than ruling them solely through force, he also supported their sanctuaries and traditions. One of the most significant examples of this support appears in the story of the Temple of Artemis. According to ancient sources and archaeological evidence found at the site, Croesus contributed substantial wealth to the rebuilding of the sanctuary. Some of the column bases discovered during excavations contain inscriptions referring to Croesus himself, indicating that he funded important parts of the construction. Such royal patronage was not unusual in the ancient world. Kings often supported temples as a way to demonstrate piety, strengthen alliances, and associate themselves with respected religious traditions. In the case of Ephesus, Croesus's support made it possible for the city to begin a project that would have been extremely difficult to finance on its own. The decision to rebuild the sanctuary on a monumental scale also reflected the ambitions of the Ephesian community. By this time, Ephesus had become a prosperous city connected to both Greek and Anatolian cultural networks. Merchants traveled regularly through its harbor, and pilgrims already visited the sanctuary of Artemis. Constructing an extraordinary temple would reinforce the city's position as a major religious destination. It would also express the deep devotion that the inhabitants felt toward their patron goddess. Ancient cities often viewed the building of temples as an act of gratitude toward the gods who protected them. The greater the temple, the stronger the expression of respect and reverence. The plans that began to emerge for the new sanctuary were remarkably ambitious. Instead of building a modest replacement for the existing structures, the designers envisioned a temple that would dominate the landscape of the region. Classical writers later recorded that the temple would be surrounded by a vast number of marble columns, and that its dimensions would surpass those of many other temples in the Greek world. Although the exact planning process remains difficult to reconstruct in detail, surviving evidence suggests that experienced architects were invited to design the project. Among the names mentioned in ancient sources are Chersiphron and his son Metagenes, who are credited with overseeing the construction of the early monumental temple. Their involvement indicates that the project required specialized knowledge and engineering skill. The architects faced several challenges, including the soft ground near the river plain where the sanctuary stood. Rather than relocating the temple to higher ground, the builders appear to have developed techniques intended to stabilize the structure in this environment. Ancient descriptions refer to layers of materials placed beneath the foundations to help distribute weight and absorb movement in the soil. Whether all of these methods worked exactly as described remains debated among historians, but the surviving ruins confirm that careful planning was required to support such a massive structure. As the project began, the sanctuary of Artemis entered a new phase of its long history. What had once been a sacred site, marked by generations of smaller temples, was now becoming the location of an architectural undertaking that would attract attention far beyond the borders of Ephesus. The decision to build on such a scale reflected both the devotion of the city's inhabitants and the support of powerful patrons. Together, these forces set the stage for the creation of a temple that later travelers would describe with admiration and awe. Once the decision had been made to construct a new temple worthy of Artemis, the challenge facing the builders was immense. Temples already existed throughout the Greek world, but most followed familiar patterns in size and design. The sanctuary planned for Ephesus would go far beyond these earlier examples. The architects responsible for the project, traditionally identified as Chersiphron and his son Metagenes, were tasked with transforming a sacred site into a structure that could match the growing reputation of the goddess and her city. Their design would need to combine religious tradition, practical engineering, and an appearance powerful enough to inspire awe in visitors arriving from distant lands. One of the most remarkable decisions made during the planning of the temple was the choice of building material. Instead of using limestone or wood, which were common in earlier temples, the builders planned to construct the entire structure from marble. In the 6th century BCE, this was an ambitious choice. Marble was far more difficult to quarry and transport than other stones, and shaping it required skilled craftsmen and specialized tools. Yet marble also possessed qualities that made it ideal for monumental architecture. Its bright surface reflected sunlight, giving buildings a luminous appearance that could be seen from a distance. For a sanctuary dedicated to a powerful goddess, such visual impact carried symbolic meaning. The gleaming marble temple would signal the wealth of Ephesus and the importance of Artemis to all who approached the city. Quarrying the marble required careful organization and labor. Large blocks had to be cut from nearby quarries and transported to the construction site. Historians believe that teams of workers used sledges, rollers, and animals to move these heavy materials across the landscape. Although ancient sources describe some unusual techniques for transporting the columns, modern scholars continue to debate exactly how these methods worked. What is clear from the surviving remains is that the columns were enormous. Each one was carved from multiple marble drums stacked on top of one another, forming pillars that reached impressive heights once assembled. The overall design of the temple followed the architectural style known as the Ionic order, which was widely used in Greek buildings along the coast of Anatolia. Ionic columns are recognizable by their elegant proportions and the distinctive spiral shapes, known as volutes, that decorate the capitals at the top of each column. In the Temple of Artemis, these columns formed a large surrounding colonnade that framed the central structure of the sanctuary. According to ancient descriptions, the temple eventually included 127 columns, each standing roughly 18 meters tall. This forest of marble pillars created a sense of scale that few visitors could ignore. Walking among them would have given the impression of entering a vast and carefully ordered space dedicated entirely to the goddess. Another significant aspect of the design involved the placement of sculptural decoration throughout the temple. In many Greek temples, sculpture served not only as ornament, but also as a way of communicating stories about gods and heroes. At Ephesus, Parts of the columns themselves were decorated with relief carvings, an unusual feature that further distinguished the building from other sanctuaries. These sculpted surfaces likely displayed mythological scenes or symbolic imagery associated with Artemis and the wider Greek pantheon. Skilled artists were required to produce such work, suggesting that craftsmen from different regions may have contributed to the project. As the temple gradually took shape, its dimensions became increasingly impressive. Ancient writers later recorded that the structure measured more than 100 meters in length and more than 50 meters in width, making it significantly larger than many temples built in the Greek mainland during the same period. The scale of the building allowed large numbers of worshippers to gather around the sanctuary during festivals and ceremonies. Yet, despite its enormous size, the temple still followed the traditional Greek concept of a house for the deity. At its center stood the inner chamber where the sacred statue of Artemis would be placed. Everything surrounding this chamber, columns, decorative sculptures, and marble platforms, served to honor and protect the presence of the goddess. For visitors approaching Ephesus during or after the temple's construction, the effect must have been striking. Rising from the flat landscape near the river plain, the marble sanctuary would have appeared both vast and luminous under the sunlight of the Aegean region. Its scale alone distinguished it from most other religious buildings of the ancient world. Through careful planning, skilled labor, and the support of powerful patrons, the sanctuary of Artemis was being transformed into an architectural achievement that would eventually capture the imagination of travelers for centuries. Constructing a temple of such enormous scale required more than artistic vision and financial support. The builders of the Temple of Artemis also faced a serious environmental challenge. The ground beneath the sanctuary was not naturally stable. The site of Ephesus lay near the broad plain formed by the Cayster River, an area where the soil contained layers of soft sediment carried by centuries of flooding. To modern observers, it may seem surprising that such a monumental structure was planned in this location at all. Yet ancient builders were often highly attentive to the characteristics of the landscapes in which they worked, and the choice of site was not necessarily accidental. Some historians believe that the marshy ground may have offered certain advantages. Soft soil can sometimes absorb vibrations better than solid rock, which might reduce the impact of earthquakes. Western Anatolia lies in a seismically active region, and ancient communities were familiar with the damage earthquakes could cause. By constructing the temple on ground capable of absorbing some movement, the builders may have hoped to protect the structure from sudden shocks that could crack stone foundations. Although the exact reasoning remains debated among modern scholars, ancient writers preserve descriptions suggesting that special measures were taken to stabilize the building. The Roman author Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, described unusual materials being placed beneath the temple's foundations. According to his account, layers of charcoal were spread across the ground and covered with fleeces of wool before the massive stones of the temple were laid on top. Pliny believed this technique helped create a stable base for the structure, while also protecting it from moisture rising through the soil. Modern archaeologists have discussed this description with caution. Some researchers consider it possible that charcoal layers were indeed used as part of a drainage or leveling system, though the precise details are difficult to confirm because later construction and centuries of environmental change have altered the site. Regardless of the exact method, it is clear that the builders invested considerable effort in preparing the foundation before the temple walls and columns were erected. Supporting such enormous marble columns required careful planning. Each column consisted of multiple cylindrical sections known as drums, which were stacked one upon another to create the full height of the pillar. The weight of these columns was immense, and the pressure they placed on the ground had to be distributed evenly across the foundation. Workers likely used carefully shaped stone blocks to create a stable platform beneath the column bases. Archaeological remains found at the site reveal large marble bases that once supported these towering pillars, demonstrating the precision required to align them correctly. Transporting and raising the column drums also demanded coordination and mechanical ingenuity. Ancient builders did not possess modern cranes or powered machines, yet they developed effective methods for moving heavy materials. Wooden scaffolding, ropes, levers, and inclined ramps were commonly used in large construction projects of the ancient Mediterranean. Classical sources suggest that the architects of the Temple of Artemis may have employed specialized techniques to roll or rotate the massive column drums during transport. While some of these accounts contain elements that historians continue to examine critically, the surviving architectural remains confirm that the builders successfully assembled columns of remarkable height and stability. As construction progressed, the temple gradually rose above the surrounding landscape. The colonnades began to frame the sacred space, and the marble surfaces reflected the sunlight of the coastal region. Each stage of construction required skilled artisans, including stonecutters, sculptors, and laborers who worked together over many years. Monumental temples were rarely completed quickly. Instead, they were often the result of sustained effort across decades, sometimes even generations. In Ephesus, the creation of the Temple of Artemis represented a collective undertaking that brought together local workers, skilled craftsmen, and the financial support of powerful patrons. By the time the main structure approached completion, the sanctuary had already begun to attract attention beyond the city itself. Travelers who heard about the scale of the new temple would have understood that something unusual was being created on the plains near the Cayster River. The builders had overcome difficult terrain, transported enormous quantities of marble, and erected a structure whose size rivaled or exceeded many other temples of the ancient world. These achievements laid the foundation for the temple's later reputation. Long before it was formally counted among the Seven Wonders, the Sanctuary of Artemis at Ephesus had already become one of the most impressive architectural projects of its time. When the main structure of the Temple of Artemis finally began to appear above the plains of Ephesus, it must have transformed the entire landscape around it. The sanctuary stood on relatively flat ground near the river valley, which meant that the rising lines of marble columns could be seen from a considerable distance. For travelers approaching the city by road or by sea, the temple would likely have been one of the first monumental sights visible on the horizon. In the ancient Mediterranean world, temples were often built in prominent locations to emphasize their religious importance. The Temple of Artemis followed this tradition, yet it did so on a scale that surpassed most other sanctuaries known at the time. Classical writers who later described the building consistently emphasized its immense size. According to ancient accounts preserved by authors such as Pliny the Elder, the temple measured roughly 115 meters in length and about 55 meters in width. These dimensions made it significantly larger than many well-known Greek temples of the classical period. Its size alone distinguished it from other religious buildings and contributed to the awe it inspired in visitors. Yet, the impression created by the temple did not come only from its measurements. Much of its visual power came from the remarkable number of columns that surrounded the structure. Ancient descriptions state that the temple was supported by 127 Ionic columns arranged in multiple rows around the central building. Each column stood approximately 18 meters tall. To imagine such a space is to picture a vast forest of marble pillars rising upward in symmetrical lines, framing the sacred building within. For someone entering the sanctuary grounds, the repeated rhythm of these towering columns would have created a powerful sense of order and scale. The Ionic style used for the columns added a distinctive elegance to the design. Unlike the heavier Doric columns often found in mainland Greek temples, Ionic columns are slimmer and more decorative. Their capitals feature graceful spiral shapes known as volutes, which curve outward at the top of each pillar. These details softened the massive scale of the building and gave the structure a sense of refinement. The combination of height, symmetry, and delicate ornamentation helped the temple achieve both grandeur and balance. Visitors would have experienced not only the physical size of the building but also the careful artistry that shaped its appearance. Another feature that distinguished the Temple of Artemis from many other Greek temples was the presence of sculptural decoration directly on some of the column bases and lower sections of the pillars. In most temples, sculpture was concentrated in the triangular pediments at the ends of the roof or along the friezes that ran above the columns. At Ephesus, however, certain columns included carved reliefs depicting figures and mythological scenes. These sculptures likely represented stories connected to the Greek gods or symbolic themes associated with Artemis. The inclusion of such decoration required additional skill from sculptors and added to the visual richness of the sanctuary. The temple platform itself was raised above the surrounding ground, allowing visitors to ascend steps before entering the colonnaded area. This elevation enhanced the sense that one was approaching a sacred and important space. From the platform, the marble surfaces of the temple would reflect the changing light of the day. In the bright sunlight common along the Aegean coast, the white marble could appear almost luminous. At sunrise or sunset, shadows cast by the columns would stretch across the platform, emphasizing the repeating geometry of the structure. Ancient travelers often described monumental buildings in terms of the emotions they produced, and the Temple of Artemis appears to have inspired a mixture of admiration and reverence. Although the temple was primarily a religious sanctuary rather than a public gathering hall, the open spaces around its colonnades allowed large numbers of worshippers to assemble during festivals and ceremonies. These gatherings reinforced the temple's role as both a spiritual center and a visible symbol of the city's prosperity. The scale of the building demonstrated the devotion of the Ephesian people to their goddess, while also signaling to visitors that this sanctuary held a special place in the religious world of the Mediterranean. As the temple stood completed, its architecture conveyed a clear message to anyone who approached its grounds. Here was a building designed not merely to shelter a statue, but to honor a deity with one of the most ambitious structures ever attempted in the Greek world. Through its size, symmetry, and careful ornamentation, the Temple of Artemis established a reputation that would spread far beyond the city that built it. For those who traveled to Ephesus in the centuries after the temple was completed, the experience of approaching the sanctuary was likely gradual and carefully structured by the layout of the sacred space. Ancient temples were rarely isolated buildings standing alone. Instead, they were usually part of larger sanctuaries that included open courtyards, altars, processional routes, and areas where worshippers could gather. The Temple of Artemis followed this tradition, yet the scale of its surroundings reflected the extraordinary reputation the sanctuary had gained. Visitors arriving at the site would first enter the broader sacred precinct, an area set apart from the everyday life of the city. This separation between ordinary and sacred space was important in ancient religious practice. Crossing into the sanctuary symbolized moving into a place under the protection and authority of the goddess. Within this precinct, worshippers might encounter smaller structures, altars, and monuments dedicated by individuals or communities who wished to honor Artemis. These offerings accumulated gradually over time. Each object placed within the sanctuary carried its own story, representing gratitude, hope, or devotion from the people who had brought it there. As visitors continued toward the temple itself, they would eventually approach the broad platform on which the building stood. The steps leading upward helped mark the transition from the outer sanctuary to the immediate presence of the temple. Climbing these steps would bring worshippers closer to the towering marble columns that surrounded the structure. From this position, the scale of the temple became even more apparent. Standing at the base of the columns, a visitor could look upward and see the intricate capitals and the long lines of stone stretching toward the roof. The careful alignment of the columns created corridors of open space through which people could move around the exterior of the building. In ancient Greek religious practice, most worship did not take place inside the temple itself. Instead, ceremonies were usually performed outdoors, often near an altar located in front of the temple. At Ephesus, the altar dedicated to Artemis likely stood within the open sanctuary area where large numbers of people could gather. During festivals or special rituals, priests and priestesses would conduct sacrifices and offerings at this altar, while the temple itself served as the sacred dwelling of the goddess. The inner chamber of the temple, known as the cella, contained the statue of Artemis and was not typically open to large crowds. The temple's design, therefore, created a balance between accessibility and sacred distance. Worshippers could approach the building, walk among its columns, and participate in ceremonies in the open space of the sanctuary. At the same time, the presence of the statue within the inner chamber preserved the sense that the goddess resided within a protected and holy environment. This arrangement was common in Greek temples, yet the scale of the Temple of Artemis made the experience especially impressive. The wide spaces surrounding the temple allowed large gatherings of people to witness rituals while still maintaining clear views of the monumental structure. Processions may have formed an important part of these religious ceremonies. In many Greek festivals, participants walked through the city carrying offerings, sacred objects, or symbolic decorations before arriving at the sanctuary. Such processions helped connect the entire community with the worship of the deity. In Ephesus, similar traditions likely guided worshippers from the city streets toward the temple of their patron goddess. As these groups approached the sanctuary, the sight of the marble columns rising above the surrounding plain would reinforce the sense that they were entering a place of exceptional importance. Over time, these repeated acts of worship helped shape the memory of the temple for generations of visitors. Travelers who returned home from Ephesus often described not only the building itself, but also the atmosphere of the sanctuary. The sound of crowds gathering for festivals, the sight of offerings dedicated to the goddess, and the presence of the towering marble structure all combined to create an experience that left a lasting impression. Through these encounters, the reputation of the Temple of Artemis spread gradually across the Mediterranean world, carried by those who had walked through its sacred precinct and witnessed its ceremonies firsthand. At the heart of the Temple of Artemis stood a space that most visitors would never fully enter. This was the inner chamber of the temple, known in Greek architecture as the cella, or naos. In the religious understanding of the ancient Greek world, the temple itself was not primarily a gathering hall for worshippers. Instead, it was regarded as the dwelling place of the deity. The structure existed to shelter the sacred image of the god or goddess, protecting it and honoring it with architecture of exceptional beauty and care. In Ephesus, the cella served exactly this purpose. Within its walls stood the sacred statue of Artemis, the figure that symbolized the divine presence believed to watch over the city. The interior of the temple would have been a quieter and more controlled environment than the open sanctuary outside. While large crowds gathered around the altar during festivals, access to the inner chamber was typically limited to priests, priestesses, and certain individuals responsible for maintaining the sacred space. This separation reinforced the idea that the goddess resided within the temple in a special way, distinct from the everyday world outside its walls. The statue itself likely stood on a carefully prepared base or platform, allowing it to be seen clearly during ritual occasions when the chamber was opened. Although the original statue has not survived, later Roman copies and artistic representations provide clues about its appearance. As described by ancient observers, the Ephesian Artemis was richly adorned with symbolic forms and decorative elements that set her apart from other Greek statues of the goddess. The figure was typically shown standing upright, with arms extended outward and the body covered in elaborate patterns representing animals, sacred objects, or symbols of abundance. This distinctive design reflected the unique character of Artemis as she was worshipped in Ephesus, blending Greek mythology with older Anatolian traditions. The temple's architecture helped emphasize the importance of this sacred image. The cella was positioned at the center of the building, surrounded by the vast colonnades that formed the outer structure of the temple. In this way, the forest of marble columns acted almost like a protective barrier around the inner chamber. The temple could therefore be understood as a series of spaces moving gradually inward toward the statue itself. Visitors would first encounter the open sanctuary, then the platform and columns of the temple, and finally the hidden chamber where the goddess was believed to reside. This progression from open public space to enclosed sacred interior reflected a common pattern in ancient temple design. Light entering the cella likely came from doorways or openings in the structure rather than from large windows. As a result, the interior atmosphere may have been dimmer than the bright marble exterior. This contrast between light and shadow could enhance the sense of reverence surrounding the statue. When visitors were permitted to glimpse the image of Artemis during ceremonies or processions, the figure may have appeared illuminated against the darker interior space, drawing attention to the sacred object at the center of the temple. Offerings dedicated to the goddess were often placed within or near the temple as well. Some of these offerings might remain in the sanctuary for many years, accumulating gradually as generations of worshippers expressed gratitude or devotion. Archaeological discoveries at the site include objects that were likely once connected with such practices. These items help historians understand how the temple functioned not only as a building, but also as a place where people sought protection, favor, or blessing from the goddess. The presence of the statue within the cellar gave meaning to the entire architectural project. Without the sacred image, the temple would have been little more than an impressive arrangement of marble columns. With the statue in place, however, the building became something far more significant. It served as the symbolic home of the goddess who protected the city, and the surrounding architecture existed to honor that presence. For visitors traveling across the ancient Mediterranean, the opportunity to stand within the sanctuary and know that the sacred image of Artemis rested inside the temple was part of what made the experience memorable. The grandeur of the building reflected the devotion of the people who had constructed it, but the statue at its center remained the true focus of the sanctuary. As the Temple of Artemis stood completed and active within its sanctuary, its influence extended far beyond the rituals performed at its altar. In the ancient Mediterranean world, major religious centers often became places where spiritual life, commerce, and travel intersected. The sanctuary at Ephesus gradually developed into one of these important gathering points. Pilgrims arrived to honor the goddess, merchants traveled alongside them, and the reputation of the temple spread steadily across distant regions. Over time, the sanctuary became not only a place of worship, but also a center of interaction that connected many parts of the ancient world. Pilgrimage played a significant role in this process. People in ancient societies frequently traveled to sacred places in order to make offerings, ask for protection, or express gratitude for blessings they believed they had received. The Temple of Artemis attracted such visitors because of the long-standing belief that the goddess protected the city and those who honored her. Some pilgrims likely came from nearby towns and villages within the region of Western Anatolia. Others may have traveled much farther, arriving by ship from islands of the Aegean Sea or from cities scattered across the Greek world. Each traveler brought personal hopes and concerns, and the act of visiting the sanctuary allowed them to participate in traditions that had already existed for generations. The presence of pilgrims naturally encouraged other forms of activity around the sanctuary. Merchants, who recognized the steady flow of visitors, saw opportunities to trade goods with travelers. Markets often developed near important sanctuaries in the ancient world, providing food, supplies, and small objects that visitors could purchase as offerings. At Ephesus, this pattern likely appeared as well. Although the temple itself remained a sacred space, the surrounding areas of the city would have welcomed the commercial exchanges that accompanied pilgrimage. This connection between religion and trade was not unusual in the Greek world. Other sanctuaries, such as Delphi and Olympia, also attracted merchants and craftsmen who served the needs of visitors attending religious festivals. In addition to individual offerings, some communities dedicated larger gifts to the goddess. These could include statues, decorated vessels, or objects made from valuable materials such as bronze or precious metals. Such offerings served both religious and social purposes. They honored the deity while also demonstrating the devotion or prosperity of the individuals or cities that presented them. Over time, sanctuaries accumulated these objects, turning them into places where visitors could see a wide variety of dedications left by people from many different regions. Archaeological excavations around the Temple of Artemis have uncovered evidence of such offerings, confirming that the sanctuary attracted gifts over long periods of time. The temple's reputation also spread through written accounts and oral stories carried by travelers. Ancient writers occasionally mentioned the sanctuary when describing the most remarkable places of the Mediterranean world. These descriptions contributed to the temple's growing fame. Even individuals who never visited Ephesus could hear about the immense marble structure dedicated to Artemis and the traditions associated with it. As these stories circulated, the sanctuary became known not only as a local religious center, but as a destination recognized across the wider Greek cultural sphere. The importance of the temple was therefore supported by several interconnected forces. Religious devotion brought pilgrims, the movement of pilgrims encouraged trade and travel, and the experiences of those visitors helped spread the temple's reputation even further. Together, these factors strengthened the position of Ephesus as one of the most prominent cities in the region. The sanctuary of Artemis stood at the center of this network, linking spiritual practice with the everyday realities of commerce and communication in the ancient world. For many visitors, the journey to Ephesus was not only a religious act, but also an opportunity to witness a building that had already become famous for its scale and beauty. Standing among its marble columns, they participated in traditions shared by thousands of others who had traveled the same path before them. Through these repeated visits, the temple gradually secured its place among the most admired sanctuaries of the ancient Mediterranean. As the reputation of the Temple of Artemis continued to grow, its role within the ancient world expanded beyond worship and pilgrimage. In many Greek and Anatolian societies, large temples were not only sacred places, but also locations of trust and protection. Because these sites were believed to belong to the gods, they often functioned as places where valuable objects could be stored safely. The sanctuary of Artemis at Ephesus gradually developed this role as well. Over time, it became known not only as a religious center, but also as a place where wealth could be held under the protection of the goddess. This idea was closely connected to the ancient belief that harming a temple or stealing from a sacred space was a serious offense against the divine. Such acts were thought to bring punishment from the gods themselves, and this belief created a powerful form of protection. Because of this, temples across the Greek world sometimes served as secure locations where individuals or communities could deposit valuables. The Temple of Artemis, with its strong reputation and wide recognition, was particularly suited to this role. The sanctuary's prestige meant that people trusted it as a place where their possessions would remain safe. Historical sources suggest that wealthy individuals, merchants, and even cities occasionally stored treasures within important temples. These items could include coins, precious metals, ceremonial objects, or valuable goods connected to trade. In Ephesus, the sanctuary of Artemis likely held such deposits over time. Although the exact inventory of stored wealth is difficult to reconstruct, archaeological discoveries of valuable offerings around the temple site support the idea that significant resources accumulated there across many generations. The temple's status as a protected space also gave rise to another important function, sanctuary. In several ancient societies, temples were considered places where individuals could seek temporary protection from harm. A person who entered a sanctuary and appealed to the protection of the deity might be granted safety, at least for a period of time. This tradition, sometimes called the right of asylum, appears in various historical sources describing sacred spaces throughout the Greek world. The sanctuary of Artemis at Ephesus was among the places associated with this practice. Individuals who feared danger or persecution could seek refuge within the sacred boundaries of the temple. While the exact rules governing sanctuary could vary from one place to another, the underlying principle remained similar. The presence of the god or goddess offered protection that ordinary political authority was expected to respect. This added another layer to the importance of the Ephesian temple. It was not only a place of prayer and ritual, but also a location where people believed divine protection could be directly experienced. Such traditions contributed to the temple's reputation for power and authority. If the sanctuary could safeguard both wealth and human life, it reinforced the idea that Artemis was a guardian not only of nature and fertility, but also of justice and order within the community. For travelers and merchants visiting Ephesus, the existence of such a sanctuary created a sense of stability. Trade networks in the ancient Mediterranean depended heavily on trust, and temples often served as anchors within these networks. When merchants knew that a respected sanctuary existed within a city, they could feel more confident conducting business there. The Temple of Artemis, therefore, supported the broader economic life of Ephesus in ways that extended beyond simple commerce. The temple's influence gradually reached into the financial and political relationships that shaped the region. Over time, this combination of religious authority, economic trust, and social protection strengthened the reputation of the sanctuary even further. Visitors who arrived in Ephesus understood that they were entering a place where the power of the goddess was expressed not only through rituals and statues, but also through the trust placed in her temple by the wider world. These multiple roles, religious, economic, and protective, help explain why the Temple of Artemis held such a prominent position in the ancient Mediterranean. It was far more than a beautiful building. It was an institution that connected belief, wealth, and community in a way that few other sanctuaries could match. As the centuries passed, the reputation of the Temple of Artemis continued to travel far beyond the city of Ephesus itself. In the ancient Mediterranean world, news did not spread through printed books or rapid communication. Instead, knowledge moved slowly through the journeys of merchants, sailors, pilgrims, and writers who described what they had seen. The Temple of Artemis became widely known through this gradual network of travelers who carried stories of the sanctuary from one region to another. Each visitor who returned home added another voice to the growing reputation of the temple. For many people living far from Ephesus, the temple was first encountered through description rather than direct experience. Greek historians and geographers sometimes mentioned the sanctuary when writing about the notable places of the known world. Among these writers was Strabo, a geographer of the early Roman period, who described the region of Western Anatolia and the cities located there. In his work Geographica, Strabo referred to Ephesus as the site of the famous Temple of Artemis, noting its importance within the surrounding region. Although his description was not extremely detailed, the fact that the temple appeared in such writings demonstrates how widely recognized the sanctuary had become by his time. Another source of information about the temple came from Pliny the Elder, a Roman author of the 1st century CE. In his encyclopedic work, Natural History, Pliny described several remarkable buildings of the ancient world, including the Temple of Artemis. He wrote about the immense size of the structure and the number of columns that surrounded it. According to Pliny's account, the temple contained 127 marble columns, each of considerable height, creating a structure that impressed visitors with its scale and craftsmanship. While modern historians carefully compare such ancient descriptions with archaeological evidence, Pliny's writing remains one of the most valuable literary sources for understanding how the temple appeared to observers in antiquity. These written accounts helped preserve the image of the sanctuary in the minds of readers who may never have visited Ephesus themselves. At the same time, travelers who physically reached the city carried their own memories back to distant lands. Sailors docking at the Ephesian harbor might speak about the shining marble temple visible across the plain. Merchants returning from trade journeys could describe the forest of columns surrounding the sanctuary. Pilgrims who had participated in ceremonies honoring Artemis would recount their experiences of walking through the sacred precinct and seeing the temple with their own eyes. Through these countless personal stories, the reputation of the temple gradually expanded across the Mediterranean world. In time, the temple's fame became strong enough that it was included in one of the earliest attempts to identify the most extraordinary constructions of human civilization. Greek writers of the Hellenistic period began compiling lists of remarkable monuments that travelers might wish to see. These lists eventually developed into what later generations would call the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Although the exact authorship of the earliest lists is uncertain, writers such as Antipater of Sidon and Philo of Byzantium later described the wonders in poetic and descriptive works. In these lists, the Temple of Artemis appeared alongside other famous constructions, such as the Great Pyramid of Giza and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Its inclusion reflected the widespread admiration the temple had already earned among travelers and observers. What made the temple particularly impressive to these writers was not only its beauty but also its scale and craftsmanship. The combination of massive marble construction, intricate sculpture, and the long history of the sanctuary created a monument that represented both artistic skill and religious devotion. When travelers compared the temple to other famous buildings they had seen, Many concluded that it deserved a place among the greatest achievements of the ancient world. Through literature, travel, and shared memory, the Temple of Artemis gradually secured a reputation that extended far beyond the city that had built it. By the time later writers recorded the list of the Seven Wonders, the temple had already become a symbol of architectural ambition and religious dedication recognized across the Mediterranean. Its fame no longer depended only on the devotion of the people of Ephesus. It had become part of the wider cultural imagination of the ancient world. For many years, the Temple of Artemis stood as a symbol of stability and devotion in the city of Ephesus. Generations of worshippers had gathered at its altar, travelers had admired its marble columns, and the sanctuary had become one of the most respected religious sites in the Mediterranean world. Yet even the most admired monuments of the ancient world were not immune to sudden disaster. In the year 356 BCE, an event occurred that would shock the inhabitants of Ephesus and quickly become known throughout the Greek world. On a single night, the great temple, one of the most magnificent structures ever built, was deliberately set on fire. Ancient historical sources record that the destruction was not caused by war, earthquake, or accident. Instead, the temple was burned by a single individual whose name would later become permanently associated with the event. According to later writers, the man responsible was called Herostratus. His motive, as reported in several ancient accounts, was unusual and disturbing. Rather than acting out of political anger or religious conflict, Herostratus reportedly wished to achieve fame by destroying something famous. By burning the temple, he believed that his name would be remembered throughout history. Although modern historians always examine ancient stories with caution, the basic outline of this event appears in multiple classical sources. Writers such as Strabo and later historians repeated the story, indicating that the burning of the temple was widely known in antiquity. The reaction of the people of Ephesus was immediate and severe. The destruction of their sacred sanctuary was not only a loss of a magnificent building but also a deeply shocking violation of a place they considered holy. Authorities in the city reportedly ordered that Herostratus be executed for his crime. In addition, they attempted to prevent his name from being remembered by forbidding anyone from speaking or recording it. This type of punishment was intended to deny the criminal the fame he sought. By erasing his name from public memory, the city hoped to ensure that the destruction of the temple would not achieve the purpose he intended. Despite this effort, the name of Herostratus survived in historical records. Ancient writers who described the burning of the temple sometimes mentioned the story precisely because of the unusual motive behind it. Over time, the episode became an example discussed by historians when reflecting on the human desire for recognition, even at the cost of destruction. The fact that the temple was burned deliberately rather than destroyed by natural forces made the event especially striking to ancient observers. One additional detail associated with this night appears in several ancient traditions. According to later writers, the burning of the temple occurred on the same night that Alexander the Great was born in Macedonia. Some storytellers in antiquity suggested that the goddess Artemis had been absent from her sanctuary because she was assisting with the birth of the future conqueror. While this explanation belongs more to the realm of myth than historical evidence, it illustrates how people of the ancient world sometimes interpreted important events through religious imagination. What remains historically clear is that the temple suffered catastrophic damage during the fire. The wooden parts of the structure, including elements of the roof and interior, would have burned rapidly once the flames began to spread. Even the marble elements of the building could not escape the effects of intense heat. By the time the fire ended, one of the greatest sanctuaries of the ancient world had been reduced to ruins. For the people of Ephesus, the destruction of the temple must have felt like the sudden loss of a symbol that had stood at the center of their community for generations. Yet the story of the Temple of Artemis did not end with this disaster. In fact, the destruction of the temple marked the beginning of another chapter in its long history, one that would ultimately lead to the construction of an even greater sanctuary than the one that had been lost. The destruction of the Temple of Artemis was not only a dramatic event, but also a deeply painful moment for the people of Ephesus. For generations, The sanctuary had stood at the center of the city's religious life. It represented the protection of the goddess, the pride of the community, and the labor of countless individuals who had contributed to its construction and maintenance. When the fire spread through the structure in 356 BCE, it did more than destroy stone and timber. It disrupted a tradition that had developed over centuries and shook the identity of the city that had built the temple in honor of its patron goddess. Ancient buildings, even those constructed with large amounts of stone, were still vulnerable to fire. While the massive marble columns of the temple were resistant to burning, many other parts of the structure contained materials that could easily ignite. Roof structures in ancient temples were often supported by wooden beams, and decorative elements within the interior could include wood, fabrics, or other combustible materials. Once flames began to spread through these sections, the heat could become intense enough to damage even the stone components of the building. The collapse of roof structures would likely have followed as the fire weakened the supporting framework. Archaeological evidence and historical descriptions suggest that the damage to the temple was extensive. Although parts of the stone structure may have remained standing after the fire, the sanctuary, as it had once existed, was effectively destroyed. The carefully crafted interior spaces, the roof, and many of the decorative elements would have been lost or severely damaged. For a building that had once been admired as one of the most magnificent temples in the Greek world, the transformation into a burned ruin must have been shocking to those who witnessed it. The immediate reaction of the Ephesian community was shaped by both grief and determination. The temple had long symbolized the bond between the city and its patron goddess. Losing such a sanctuary could easily have been interpreted as a sign of divine anger or misfortune. Yet rather than abandoning the sacred site, the people of Ephesus appear to have responded by reaffirming their commitment to Artemis. Historical traditions indicate that plans to rebuild the temple began not long after the destruction. The desire to restore the sanctuary was strong, and many inhabitants believed that the goddess deserved a temple even greater than the one that had been lost. This response was not unusual in the ancient world. Cities often rebuilt temples after disasters, sometimes using the opportunity to create structures that surpassed their predecessors. Rebuilding allowed communities to demonstrate resilience and renew their relationship with the gods they worshipped. In Ephesus, the destruction of the temple may have strengthened the determination of the people to create something even more remarkable. The ruins of the burned sanctuary remained a powerful reminder of what had been lost, but they also served as the foundation for a new beginning. The rebuilding effort would require resources, organization, and skilled labor similar to those involved in the original construction. Yet the fame of the temple meant that its restoration attracted attention beyond the city itself. Travelers, patrons, and rulers from other regions were aware of the sanctuary's importance. As news of the destruction spread across the Mediterranean, the question was no longer whether the temple would be rebuilt, but how grand the new sanctuary might become. In this way, the fire that destroyed the Temple of Artemis did not erase its place in the ancient world. Instead, it marked a turning point in the temple's story. The loss of the original structure created the conditions for a second temple, one that many later visitors believed surpassed even the first in beauty and scale. In the years following the destruction of the Temple of Artemis, the people of Ephesus faced an important decision. The ruins of the burned sanctuary still marked the sacred ground where generations had worshipped the goddess. Abandoning the site was never seriously considered. The sanctuary had existed there for centuries, long before the great marble temple had been built, and the connection between the city and the goddess remained strong. Instead, the question became how the temple should be rebuilt. The earlier structure had already been admired throughout the Mediterranean world, but the Ephesian community now had an opportunity to create something even greater. Rebuilding the temple was therefore not only an act of restoration, but also a declaration that the city's devotion to Artemis had not been broken by disaster. Historical traditions suggest that the reconstruction began with strong support from the citizens of Ephesus themselves. The city gathered resources and organized the effort to restore the sanctuary. Inscriptions and later accounts indicate that contributions came from various parts of the community, reflecting a collective commitment to rebuilding the temple. This shared effort helped reinforce the idea that the sanctuary belonged not only to priests or rulers but to the entire city. The rebuilding of the temple was therefore both a religious duty and a civic project that united the inhabitants of Ephesus. During this period, another figure entered the story whose name would become famous across the ancient world. Alexander the Great, the Macedonian king who would later create one of the largest empires of antiquity, passed through the region during his campaigns in Anatolia in the 4th century BCE. According to several ancient sources, Alexander offered to finance the reconstruction of the temple. Such an offer would have been a significant gesture. By associating himself with the rebuilding of a sanctuary already known throughout the Greek world, Alexander could demonstrate both his wealth and his respect for Greek religious traditions. However, the citizens of Ephesus are said to have declined this offer in a diplomatic way that later writers found memorable. According to the story preserved by ancient historians, the Ephesian representatives responded that it would not be appropriate for one god to build a temple to another. This remark referred indirectly to Alexander himself, who in some traditions was regarded as possessing divine qualities or favor from the gods. By framing their refusal in this respectful manner, the people of Ephesus avoided offending the powerful ruler while still maintaining their independence in rebuilding the sanctuary dedicated to their goddess. Whether the exact wording of this response is historically precise remains uncertain, as ancient authors sometimes shaped stories to emphasize symbolic meaning. Nevertheless, the tradition reflects an important point. The people of Ephesus wanted the Temple of Artemis to remain a project closely connected to their own community. Rebuilding the sanctuary with their own resources allowed them to reaffirm the bond between the city and its patron deity. Work on the new temple, therefore, continued under the direction of Ephesian authorities and skilled architects. The reconstruction did not simply aim to reproduce the earlier temple exactly as it had been before the fire. Instead, the builders planned a structure that would equal or surpass the original in scale and beauty. Using the experience gained from earlier construction, they expanded certain elements of the design and refined the artistic decoration. The new temple retained the essential features that had made the earlier sanctuary famous: its marble construction, its forest of Ionic columns, and its central chamber housing the sacred statue of Artemis. Yet the rebuilt structure incorporated improvements that made it even more impressive to later visitors. As the new temple gradually rose from the ruins of the old one, the sanctuary of Artemis regained its place as the spiritual center of Ephesus. Travelers who visited the city in later centuries described the temple with admiration, often noting that its beauty surpassed many other buildings of the Greek world. In this way, the destruction of the original temple did not mark the end of its story. Instead, the rebuilding of the sanctuary ensured that the Temple of Artemis would continue to inspire visitors and writers for generations to come. When the rebuilt Temple of Artemis began to take shape, the sanctuary entered a new phase of its long history. The fire of 356 BCE had destroyed the earlier structure, but the rebuilding effort gave the people of Ephesus an opportunity to create something even more remarkable. Over time, the new temple rose across the same sacred ground where generations had worshipped the goddess. Visitors arriving in later centuries would see a structure that combined the traditions of the earlier sanctuary with renewed ambition in architecture and design. The result was a temple that many ancient observers believed surpassed the original in both scale and beauty. Although the rebuilt temple followed the general layout of its predecessor, the builders refined and expanded several elements of the design. The wide marble platform still supported rows of towering Ionic columns, but the new structure emphasized symmetry and proportion in ways that impressed visitors from across the Mediterranean. The use of marble throughout the temple continued to be one of its defining features. Under the bright sunlight of the Aegean region, the stone surfaces reflected light in a way that made the building appear luminous from a distance. Travelers approaching the sanctuary often described the temple as standing out clearly against the surrounding landscape of the Ephesian plain. Ancient writers who visited or heard about the rebuilt temple frequently commented on its artistic decoration. Sculptors and craftsmen contributed elaborate carvings that decorated the columns, the bases, and other architectural elements of the structure. Some of these sculptures likely depicted mythological scenes connected to the gods of the Greek world, while others may have represented symbolic imagery associated with Artemis herself. The presence of such artwork meant that the temple was not only an example of architectural skill, but also a display of artistic achievement. Each carved surface demonstrated the craftsmanship of the artists who had helped transform the sanctuary into a place of visual richness. The temple's scale continued to impress those who saw it. With its length extending over 100 meters and its forest of tall columns surrounding the central chamber, the building created a sense of vastness that few other temples could match. Even visitors familiar with famous sanctuaries in Greece found the Ephesian temple striking. The wide spaces between the columns allowed light and air to move through the structure, giving the building a sense of openness despite its enormous size. Walking around the temple would have taken time, and each viewpoint revealed new details in the arrangement of columns and sculptures. The rebuilt sanctuary also preserved the spiritual role that had always defined the site. At its center stood the sacred statue of Artemis, the image believed to embody the presence of the goddess. The temple, therefore, remained a place where rituals and offerings connected worshippers with the deity who protected the city. Festivals and ceremonies continued to bring pilgrims to Ephesus, and the temple remained the focal point of these gatherings. The architectural magnificence of the building reinforced the belief that Artemis deserved the finest sanctuary her followers could provide. As news of the rebuilt temple spread through the Mediterranean world, its reputation grew steadily. Travelers who visited the sanctuary carried their impressions back to distant cities. Writers included the temple in descriptions of notable monuments, praising the skill of its builders and the beauty of its design. Through these accounts, the Temple of Artemis came to represent not only the devotion of the people of Ephesus, but also the broader achievements of Greek architecture and artistry. For many observers in antiquity, the temple demonstrated what human communities could accomplish when religious belief, artistic talent, and material resources came together. Over time, admiration for the temple became so widespread that it was included in lists of the most extraordinary monuments ever created. The sanctuary that had once risen slowly from centuries of devotion was now widely recognized as one of the greatest architectural achievements of the ancient world. The rebuilt Temple of Artemis did more than replace the structure lost in the fire. It elevated the sanctuary to a level of fame that would endure long after the city of Ephesus itself had begun to change. As the rebuilt Temple of Artemis continued to attract visitors, its reputation gradually moved beyond admiration and entered the realm of legend. Travelers who returned from Ephesus often described the sanctuary as something unlike any other building they had encountered. In the ancient world, journeys could take weeks or months, and travelers carried their memories with them across seas and roads. When they spoke about the places they had visited, certain monuments stood out in their stories. The Temple of Artemis became one of those places whose reputation grew with every retelling. Writers and poets of the Hellenistic period began to collect descriptions of remarkable structures from across the known world. These writers were interested in identifying buildings that demonstrated the highest achievements of human skill and ambition. Among the monuments they admired were enormous statues, royal tombs, towering walls, and grand temples. When they compared these structures, the Temple of Artemis frequently appeared among the most impressive. Its immense marble colonnades, artistic decoration, and long religious history made it stand out even among other great sanctuaries of the Mediterranean. One of the most well-known references to the temple appears in a short poem attributed to Antipater of Sidon, a Greek writer of the 2nd century BCE. Antipater described several extraordinary monuments that travelers admired across the ancient world. In his poem, he mentioned the walls of Babylon, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, the pyramids of Egypt, and other famous constructions. Yet, after listing these wonders, he wrote that when he saw the Temple of Artemis reaching toward the clouds, the other monuments seemed less impressive by comparison. While poetic language often exaggerates for effect, The poem reflects how strongly the temple impressed those who encountered it. The sanctuary was not simply admired for its size. Observers also recognized the harmony of its design and the quality of its craftsmanship. The repeated lines of marble columns, the detailed sculptures carved into the structure, and the vast open space surrounding the temple created an environment that felt both orderly and majestic. Visitors could walk through the colonnades, view the artistic decoration up close, and participate in ceremonies honoring the goddess. This combination of architectural beauty and living religious tradition made the temple feel both monumental and meaningful. Another reason the temple attracted attention was its location within the wider Greek cultural world. Ephesus stood along important trade routes, connecting the Aegean Sea with the interior of Anatolia. Merchants, sailors, and pilgrims frequently passed through the region, carrying news of the temple with them. Because so many travelers visited the city, the sanctuary's reputation spread faster than that of many other monuments built in more isolated places. Even those who never saw the temple personally could hear detailed descriptions from people who had walked among its columns. Over time, lists of extraordinary monuments began to circulate more widely among writers and scholars. These lists eventually became known as the Seven Wonders of the Ancient World. Although the exact composition of the list varied slightly in different sources, the Temple of Artemis consistently appeared among the selected monuments. Its inclusion placed it alongside other famous constructions, such as the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, and the statue of Zeus at Olympia. Each of these monuments represented a different form of human achievement: engineering, sculpture, architecture, or royal ambition. The Temple of Artemis represented the combination of religious devotion and architectural mastery. For ancient observers, the temple embodied a particular idea about the relationship between humanity and the divine. The building had been created not only to demonstrate wealth or political power, but also to honor a goddess who was believed to protect the city and its people. The immense scale of the sanctuary reflected the depth of that devotion. When travelers looked upon the marble columns and carefully carved sculptures, they saw more than a building. They saw a monument that expressed centuries of belief, artistry, and communal effort. Through poetry, historical writing, and the shared memories of travelers, the Temple of Artemis became firmly established in the cultural imagination of the ancient world. Long before the modern concept of historical preservation existed, the temple had already achieved a kind of immortality through the stories people told about it. These stories ensured that the sanctuary would be remembered not only as a religious center of Ephesus, but also as one of the greatest architectural wonders ever created. For many centuries after its reconstruction, the Temple of Artemis continued to stand as one of the most recognized landmarks of the ancient Mediterranean world. Empires rose and fell across the region, yet the sanctuary at Ephesus remained active and respected through changing political landscapes. Greek city-states, Hellenistic kingdoms, and eventually the Roman Empire all left their influence on the region, but the temple itself retained its role as the spiritual heart of the city. Visitors arriving in Ephesus during these later periods still encountered the same towering marble structure that earlier travelers had admired. Its columns framed the sacred space, its sculptures decorated the architecture, and the statue of Artemis continued to symbolize the presence of the goddess within the temple. Under Roman rule, the city of Ephesus became one of the largest and most prosperous urban centers in the eastern Mediterranean. The harbor connected the city to major trade routes, and the population grew as merchants, officials, and travelers moved through the region. In this thriving environment, the Temple of Artemis remained an important part of civic identity. Roman authorities generally respected local religious traditions, especially when those traditions were already well established. As a result, the sanctuary continued to receive attention and maintenance, ensuring that the temple remained an active place of worship. Pilgrims still arrived from distant regions to honor the goddess and participate in ceremonies that had been practiced for generations. Festivals dedicated to Artemis continued to draw large gatherings of people to the sanctuary. These events reinforced the connection between the goddess and the city that honored her. Processions moved through the streets of Ephesus, linking the life of the community with the sacred precinct where the temple stood. Musicians, priests, and participants carrying offerings would eventually reach the sanctuary, where rituals were performed before the altar of the goddess. For visitors attending such festivals, the experience combined religious devotion with the visual spectacle of one of the most impressive buildings in the ancient world. In addition to religious ceremonies, the temple remained associated with the traditions of refuge and protection that had developed earlier in its history. Sacred boundaries marked the sanctuary, and the presence of the goddess continued to be linked with ideas of security and justice. Ancient sources occasionally mention individuals seeking protection within temple grounds, reflecting the continued importance of such traditions in the cultural life of the region. These practices reinforced the perception that the sanctuary was not only a monument of architecture, but also a place where the authority of the goddess could be felt in everyday life. The temple's reputation also ensured that it remained a destination for travelers who were interested in seeing famous monuments. Just as earlier visitors had carried stories of the sanctuary across the Mediterranean, Roman-era travelers continued to describe it in their accounts of remarkable places. The temple therefore functioned both as a living religious center and as a monument admired for its artistic and architectural qualities. Even individuals who did not share the same religious devotion could still appreciate the skill required to construct such a building. This combination of roles helped sustain the temple's fame for centuries, yet the world surrounding Ephesus gradually began to change. New political structures, evolving cultural traditions, and shifts in religious belief slowly altered the landscape of the Mediterranean. The temple continued to stand through these transformations, but its future would eventually be shaped by forces that the builders of the sanctuary could never have anticipated. For generations, however, the Temple of Artemis remained exactly what ancient writers had described, a magnificent structure dedicated to a powerful goddess and admired by travelers from across the known world. Its long life as an active sanctuary ensured that its reputation endured far beyond the time when its marble columns were first raised above the plains of Ephesus. For many centuries, the Temple of Artemis continued to stand as one of the most admired monuments in the Mediterranean world. Yet the history of the ancient world was rarely static. Cities prospered and declined, trade routes shifted, and political control passed from one power to another. Although the sanctuary of Artemis remained active for a long time, the environment surrounding it slowly began to change. These changes did not destroy the temple immediately, but they gradually altered the conditions that had once allowed it to flourish. Understanding these shifts helps explain why a monument that had once been celebrated as one of the seven wonders would eventually disappear from the landscape. One of the most important changes involved the geography of Ephesus itself. The city had originally prospered because of its access to the sea through the harbor connected to the Cayster River. This harbor allowed merchants and travelers to reach the city easily by ship, bringing goods and visitors from across the Mediterranean. Over time, however, natural processes slowly altered the coastline. Sediment carried by the river began to accumulate in the harbor area. As centuries passed, these deposits gradually filled parts of the channel that once allowed ships to approach the city. Harbors in the ancient world required constant maintenance to remain open, and when sediment built up faster than it could be removed, access to the sea became more difficult. For Ephesus, this slow environmental change had long-term consequences. As the harbor became shallower, maritime trade declined, and the city's position as a major port gradually weakened. Despite these environmental challenges, Ephesus remained an important urban center for a considerable time. Under Roman rule, the city continued to flourish as an administrative and cultural hub of the region. Roman investment in public buildings, roads, and infrastructure helped maintain the city's prosperity for several centuries. During this period, the Temple of Artemis still attracted pilgrims and visitors who wished to see the famous sanctuary. Travelers who arrived in the city could still walk among the towering marble columns that had impressed earlier generations. The temple remained both a functioning religious center and a symbol of the city's identity. However, political stability across the region was not always guaranteed. The Roman Empire, which had provided relative order across the Mediterranean, began to face increasing pressures during the later centuries of its existence. Conflicts along the empire's frontiers became more frequent, and internal political struggles sometimes weakened the central government's ability to maintain control over distant provinces. While Ephesus remained an important city, it could not completely escape the broader changes affecting the empire. As instability grew in some areas, the protection that had once allowed monuments like the Temple of Artemis to stand undisturbed for centuries became less certain. Another transformation involved the gradual evolution of religious life in the Roman world. For many generations, traditional polytheistic worship had shaped the cultural landscape of cities such as Ephesus. Temples dedicated to gods and goddesses formed central parts of civic identity, and festivals honoring these deities were deeply connected to community life. Yet over time, new religious ideas began to spread through the empire. Among these emerging traditions was Christianity, which gradually attracted followers in many cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. Early Christian communities appeared in several urban centers, including Ephesus itself. While these communities initially existed alongside traditional religious practices, the growth of Christianity would eventually reshape the spiritual life of the region. During the early stages of this transformation, the Temple of Artemis still stood as a powerful reminder of older traditions. Pilgrims continued to visit, rituals were still performed, and the sanctuary remained visible across the plains near the ancient city. Yet the religious landscape surrounding the temple was no longer exactly the same as it had been during earlier centuries. New beliefs, new communities, and changing political realities were gradually altering the environment in which the temple existed. These shifts did not immediately erase the temple's importance, but they marked the beginning of a long process that would eventually affect its future. For visitors during this transitional period, the Temple of Artemis may have appeared unchanged. Its marble columns still rose above the sanctuary, and the sacred statue of the goddess still occupied its place within the temple. Yet beneath this appearance of continuity, the world around the sanctuary was slowly transforming. Trade routes were evolving, political power was shifting, and religious traditions were beginning to change. The temple that had once symbolized the stability of Ephesian life now stood within a world moving gradually toward a different future. By the 3rd century CE, the wider Roman world had entered a period that historians often describe as a time of instability. Political leadership within the empire changed frequently. Military conflicts occurred along many frontiers, and several regions experienced waves of external attacks. These conditions affected numerous cities across the Mediterranean, including those that had once enjoyed long periods of prosperity and security. Ephesus, despite its history as a wealthy and culturally important center, was not entirely shielded from these wider developments. During this period, the Temple of Artemis, long admired as one of the most magnificent sanctuaries of the ancient world, faced a new threat that came not from natural disaster or internal conflict, but from forces moving across the frontiers of the Roman Empire. Ancient historical sources record that in the year 262 CE, groups known as the Goths carried out raids along parts of the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Goths were not a single unified nation, but rather groups of people originating from regions north of the Black Sea who occasionally moved into Roman territory during times of imperial weakness. These incursions sometimes involved attacks on coastal cities and important settlements. Written records from the period suggest that during one of these raids, Ephesus was among the cities affected. According to several historical accounts, the sanctuary of Artemis suffered significant damage during this period of conflict. The attackers were likely attracted by the wealth that had accumulated at the sanctuary over many centuries. Temples often stored valuable offerings, precious metals, and other goods dedicated by worshippers. Even if the invaders did not fully understand the religious importance of the site, they would have recognized the temple as a place where valuable materials might be found. As a result, the sanctuary became vulnerable during the raid. Although the exact details of the destruction are not completely preserved, later historical references indicate that the temple was badly damaged during the Gothic attack. Some parts of the structure may have been burned or dismantled, while valuable objects stored within the sanctuary were likely taken. By this time, the temple had already stood for several centuries since its reconstruction, and maintaining such a large structure required constant care. Once significant damage occurred, restoring the building to its former condition would have demanded enormous resources. Unlike the earlier fire in the 4th century BCE, which had inspired the people of Ephesus to rebuild the sanctuary on an even grander scale, the circumstances of the 3rd century CE were very different. The Roman Empire was facing multiple crises across its territories, and local communities often lacked the stability or resources needed for massive reconstruction projects. Although Ephesus remained an important city, the political and economic conditions that had once supported the creation of monumental temples were no longer the same. Archaeological evidence from the site suggests that while parts of the sanctuary may have continued to be used after the attack, the temple itself was never fully restored to the magnificent state it had once achieved. The towering marble columns that had impressed generations of visitors gradually fell into ruin. Some stones may have been reused in later construction projects within the city, a common practice in the ancient world when large structures were abandoned or damaged beyond repair. Despite this decline, the memory of the temple remained powerful. Travelers and writers continued to refer to the Temple of Artemis when discussing the great monuments of earlier centuries. Even as the physical structure began to deteriorate, its reputation as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world persisted in historical texts and cultural memory. The sanctuary that had once attracted pilgrims and merchants from across the Mediterranean was slowly transitioning from a living religious center into a historical monument remembered for its past greatness. For the people living in Ephesus during these later centuries, the transformation of the sanctuary must have been gradual. The temple that earlier generations had admired as a shining marble wonder was no longer maintained in the same way. Yet the landscape still carried traces of its former grandeur. Fragments of columns, fallen stones, and the outlines of foundations continued to mark the ground where the sanctuary had once stood in full splendor. These remains served as reminders of a time when the city had built one of the most extraordinary temples in the ancient world. In the centuries that followed the Gothic raid, the world around Ephesus continued to change in ways that gradually altered the place of the Temple of Artemis within society. The physical damage to the sanctuary had already weakened the structure, but another transformation was taking place at the same time. Across the Roman Empire, religious life was slowly shifting. Traditions that had shaped the ancient Mediterranean for hundreds of years began to encounter new beliefs and new communities that interpreted the world in different ways. These changes did not happen suddenly. Instead, they unfolded over generations, gradually reshaping the cultural landscape in which temples, like the Sanctuary of Artemis, had once flourished. One of the most significant developments during this period was the spread of Christianity. By the 1st century CE, small Christian communities had already appeared in several cities of the eastern Mediterranean, including Ephesus. Early Christian texts even refer to the city as an important location for the development of the new faith. At first, these communities existed alongside traditional religious practices. Temples dedicated to the Greek and Roman gods continued to function, and many people remained devoted to the deities they had worshipped for generations. Over time, however, Christianity gained increasing numbers of followers throughout the empire. The position of Christianity changed dramatically in the 4th century CE when the Roman Emperor Constantine issued policies that allowed Christians to practice their religion openly. Later, emperors went even further by supporting Christianity more directly. As imperial support grew, Christian communities expanded and began to play a larger role in public life. This transformation gradually affected the role of traditional temples. Sanctuaries that had once been central to civic identity began to lose the same level of public support they had previously enjoyed. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was closely tied to older religious traditions that had existed for centuries. Its rituals, festivals, and priesthoods were all connected to the worship of a goddess whose identity was rooted in the ancient polytheistic world. As Christianity spread, fewer people participated in these older traditions. Over time, the number of pilgrims traveling to the sanctuary likely declined. Without the same level of devotion and resources devoted to its maintenance, the temple's condition continued to deteriorate. Historical records from late antiquity suggest that imperial policies eventually restricted or discouraged the practice of traditional pagan rituals. In the late 4th century CE, emperors such as Theodosius I issued laws that limited public worship associated with the older religions of the empire. These laws did not always result in the immediate destruction of temples, but they did change the legal and cultural environment in which such sanctuaries existed. Without official support, and with fewer worshippers maintaining their traditions, many ancient temples gradually fell into disuse. At Ephesus, the Temple of Artemis experienced this gradual decline rather than a single dramatic moment of disappearance. The building had already suffered damage during earlier conflicts, and the lack of continued restoration meant that its structure slowly deteriorated. Marble blocks and other architectural elements may have been removed over time for use in later construction projects in the surrounding area. This reuse of materials was common in the ancient world, especially when large monuments were no longer actively maintained. By the early centuries of the Byzantine period, the once famous sanctuary had largely lost its original function. The temple that had drawn pilgrims and travelers from across the Mediterranean was no longer the center of religious life in the region, yet its memory remained strong in historical writing. Authors who described the 7 wonders of the ancient world continued to include the Temple of Artemis in their lists, even as the physical structure itself faded from the landscape. The transformation of the sanctuary was therefore not the result of a single event, but the outcome of several long-term changes. Environmental shifts, political instability, and the evolution of religious traditions all played roles in shaping the fate of the temple. What had once been one of the most magnificent monuments of the ancient world gradually became a site remembered more through stories than through its remaining stones. After the Temple of Artemis gradually lost its role as an active sanctuary, the physical structure did not disappear immediately. Massive monuments built from stone often remained standing long after the religious traditions that created them had faded. For a time, the remains of the temple still marked the landscape near the ancient city of Ephesus. Travelers who passed through the region during late antiquity could likely still see portions of the once great structure. Columns, fragments of marble blocks, and sections of the platform continued to stand as silent reminders of the sanctuary that had once been admired across the Mediterranean world. Yet monuments of the ancient world rarely remained untouched when their original purpose ended. In many cities, abandoned temples became sources of building material for later generations. Marble and carefully shaped stone blocks were valuable resources, and quarrying fresh stone required labor and expense. When large monuments fell into disuse, their materials were often reused in new construction projects. This process did not necessarily occur all at once. Instead, it happened gradually over long periods of time as local communities repurposed the stones for practical needs. The Temple of Artemis appears to have experienced this same slow transformation. As the sanctuary declined, parts of the structure were likely dismantled and incorporated into other buildings within the surrounding region. Archaeologists studying ancient Ephesus have found evidence that materials from earlier monuments were reused in later structures. Columns, carved blocks, and architectural fragments could be transported and reshaped for new purposes. Through this process, elements of the once great temple may have been scattered throughout the city and nearby settlements. At the same time, the environment around Ephesus continued to change. The river that had once connected the city to the sea carried increasing amounts of sediment into the surrounding plains. Over centuries, this natural process gradually altered the landscape. Areas that had once been close to the harbor became marshy ground as deposits built up. These environmental changes affected not only the city itself, but also the sanctuary where the Temple of Artemis had stood. As the land slowly shifted, parts of the ancient site became buried beneath layers of soil and sediment. Because of these changes, the visible remains of the temple became less prominent over time. What had once been a towering structure with rows of marble columns gradually broke apart into scattered fragments. Fallen stones were partially covered by earth, vegetation grew across the site, and the outlines of the sanctuary became harder to recognize. By the early medieval period, the once famous temple had largely disappeared from the everyday awareness of the people living in the region. The memory of its existence survived primarily in historical texts written by earlier authors. Despite the physical disappearance of much of the structure, those written descriptions preserved important information about the temple's former grandeur. Scholars in later centuries continued to read the works of Greek and Roman writers who had recorded the wonders of the ancient world. Through these texts, the Temple of Artemis remained part of historical knowledge, even when its ruins were no longer widely visible. Readers encountered the sanctuary as one of the Seven Wonders, a monument that had once stood among the greatest achievements of ancient architecture. For many centuries, however, the precise location of the temple was not clearly understood by people outside the region. The ancient city of Ephesus itself had declined, and new settlements developed in nearby areas. Without continuous archaeological study, the exact site of the sanctuary became difficult to identify. Travelers who read about the temple in classical writings sometimes searched for its remains, but found only scattered stones or fragments whose connection to the famous sanctuary was uncertain. In this way, the Temple of Artemis gradually passed from a visible monument into a historical mystery. Its memory survived in literature and cultural tradition, yet the physical structure that had once inspired such admiration had nearly vanished from the landscape. The plain near Ephesus still held the remnants of the sanctuary beneath its soil, waiting for a time when scholars would begin to investigate the ancient past with new methods and renewed curiosity. For many centuries after the Temple of Artemis disappeared from the visible landscape, knowledge of its existence survived mainly through ancient writings. Greek and Roman authors had described the temple in enough detail that scholars in later eras knew it had once stood somewhere near the city of Ephesus, yet the exact location of the sanctuary was uncertain. As the ancient city declined and new settlements developed in the surrounding region, the physical traces of the temple became increasingly difficult to identify. By the early modern period, travelers who visited the area often saw scattered ruins from many different historical periods, but could not easily determine where the famous sanctuary had once stood. Interest in rediscovering the monuments of the ancient world began to grow strongly in the 19th century. During this time, scholars and explorers from Europe increasingly traveled to regions of the Eastern Mediterranean to study the remains of ancient Greek and Roman civilizations. Archaeology was still developing as a scientific discipline, but researchers were becoming more systematic in their efforts to locate lost cities and monuments described in classical texts. The search for the Temple of Artemis became one of the most intriguing challenges connected to this broader interest in the ancient past. One of the most important figures involved in this search was John Turtle Wood, a British architect and engineer who worked for the British Museum. In the 1860s, Wood traveled to Western Anatolia with the goal of locating the site of the famous temple. Rather than simply exploring the landscape at random, he carefully studied ancient written sources that described Ephesus and its surroundings. Among the texts he consulted were works by classical authors who mentioned the sanctuary and its relationship to roads, city gates, and other landmarks. By comparing these descriptions with the geography of the region, Wood began forming ideas about where the temple might be located. The search proved extremely difficult. Much of the ancient landscape had changed over time. Sediment from the nearby river had altered the terrain, and centuries of agricultural activity had covered parts of the ancient ruins. In some areas, thick layers of soil concealed whatever structures remained beneath the surface. Wood and his team spent several years conducting excavations and surveys in different parts of the area near Ephesus. Progress was often slow, and at times the search produced few clear results. A breakthrough finally came in 1869. During excavations in a marshy area not far from the ancient city, Wood's team uncovered architectural remains that matched the descriptions of the Temple of Artemis preserved in classical sources. Among the discoveries were large stone blocks and fragments of marble columns that had once belonged to the sanctuary. As excavations continued, more pieces of the temple emerged from the soil, confirming that the long-lost wonder had indeed been located. Although the temple had been almost completely destroyed over the centuries, the archaeological remains provided valuable information about its structure. Column bases, sculptural fragments, and other architectural elements helped scholars understand the scale and design of the building. Some of the discoveries were later transported to museums, including the British Museum in London, where they could be studied and preserved. These artifacts offered rare physical evidence of a monument that had previously been known mainly through ancient descriptions. The rediscovery of the Temple of Artemis marked an important moment in the history of archaeology. It demonstrated that careful study of ancient texts, combined with systematic excavation, could reveal the locations of monuments that had been lost for centuries. The discovery also renewed interest in the history of Ephesus and encouraged further archaeological work in the region. Over time, additional excavations uncovered more details about the ancient city and the sanctuary that had once stood at its edge. Today, visitors who travel to the site near modern Selçuk in Turkey will not see the immense marble temple that ancient travelers admired. Most of the structure has long since vanished, and only fragments of its foundations remain. A single reconstructed column now rises above the plain, assembled from pieces found during archaeological work. Though modest compared to the temple's original grandeur, this column stands as a reminder of the sanctuary that once inspired awe across the ancient world. Today, the place where the Temple of Artemis once stood appears far quieter than ancient travelers would have imagined. The broad plain near the ruins of Ephesus, not far from the modern town of Selçuk in western Turkey, contains only a few visible traces of the sanctuary that once attracted visitors from across the Mediterranean world. Those who arrive at the site expecting to see towering rows of marble columns may be surprised by what they find. Instead of a vast temple dominating the landscape, the remains consist mainly of scattered stones, fragments of foundations, and one partially reconstructed column rising from the ground. Yet even these modest remains carry the weight of a remarkable history. The column that stands at the site today was assembled from several surviving pieces discovered during archaeological excavations. Although it represents only a small portion of the original structure, it offers a visual reference point that helps visitors imagine the scale of the ancient temple. When the sanctuary was at its height, more than 100 columns like this once surrounded the temple. Each column stood roughly 18 meters tall, forming the immense colonnade that ancient writers described with admiration. Seeing even a single column today allows visitors to consider how extraordinary the full forest of pillars must have appeared in antiquity. Around this column lie the foundations of the temple platform. Archaeological work has uncovered the outlines of the building's base, providing clues about its dimensions and layout. These stone foundations reveal the footprint of a structure that stretched well over 100 meters in length. When historians compare these remains with ancient descriptions from writers such as Pliny the Elder, they can reconstruct a clearer picture of the temple's architecture. Through careful measurement and study, archaeologists have been able to estimate the arrangement of the columns, the size of the inner chamber, and the overall scale of the sanctuary. Fragments of sculpture and architectural decoration discovered during excavations have also helped researchers understand how richly decorated the temple once was. Some of these pieces include parts of column bases carved with relief figures and other ornamental elements. These fragments demonstrate the level of artistic skill involved in constructing the sanctuary. Although many original sculptures were damaged or lost over time, the surviving pieces confirm that the temple combined monumental architecture with detailed artistic work. Many of the most important artifacts recovered from the site are now preserved in museums. Collections in places such as the British Museum and museums in Turkey display column fragments, sculptural remains, and objects associated with the sanctuary. These preserved artifacts allow scholars and visitors to study the temple's artistic and architectural features more closely than would be possible at the open-air site alone. By examining these materials, historians have been able to reconstruct aspects of the temple that are no longer visible on the plain where it once stood. Standing at the site today requires a different kind of imagination than ancient visitors would have needed. Instead of marveling at a towering sanctuary of marble, modern travelers must piece together the story from fragments and historical records. The quiet landscape holds the remains of foundations buried beneath the soil, traces of the once grand sanctuary that defined the identity of Ephesus for centuries. The marshy ground and scattered stones offer little hint of the building that ancient writers placed among the greatest wonders of the world. Yet in a way, this contrast between past and present adds another layer to the story of the Temple of Artemis. The ruins remind us that even the most celebrated monuments can disappear over time. What remains are the traces that historians, archaeologists, and travelers continue to study in order to understand the achievements of earlier civilizations. Through excavation, scholarship, and preservation, the memory of the temple has survived long after its marble columns collapsed. Today, the site stands as both an archaeological location and a symbol of the ancient world's creativity and devotion. The fragments scattered across the plain represent the remains of a sanctuary that once inspired poets, travelers, and historians. Although the Temple of Artemis no longer rises above the landscape as it once did, the story of its construction, destruction, and rediscovery continues to connect the modern world with one of the most remarkable achievements of ancient architecture. When ancient writers spoke about the seven wonders of the world, they were not simply listing the largest buildings or the most expensive monuments. The idea behind these lists was to identify places that represented the highest achievements of human creativity, effort, and imagination. Each wonder stood as an example of what people could accomplish when resources, skill, and cultural meaning came together in a single project. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus earned its place among these wonders for several reasons, and understanding them helps explain why travelers and historians remembered the sanctuary long after its marble columns had fallen. One reason was the sheer scale of the building. In the ancient Greek world, temples were common features of cities and sanctuaries, yet the Temple of Artemis was far larger than most other temples built during the same period. With a length of more than 100 meters and a wide platform surrounded by over 100 columns, the structure created a visual impact that few other religious buildings could match. Visitors approaching the sanctuary encountered not just a temple, but a massive architectural complex rising from the plains near Ephesus. The repetition of tall marble columns formed an environment that felt almost like walking through a carefully ordered forest of stone. This scale alone would have impressed travelers who had seen many other temples across the Mediterranean. A second reason for the temple's reputation was the extraordinary use of marble. While marble was used in other Greek buildings, constructing an entire temple from this material on such a scale required enormous resources and skilled labor. Quarrying the stone, transporting the heavy blocks, shaping them into architectural elements, and assembling them into a stable structure demanded years of coordinated work. The result was a building whose bright surfaces reflected the sunlight of the Aegean region, creating the luminous appearance that ancient writers frequently described. To visitors arriving from distant lands, the shining marble sanctuary symbolized both the wealth of Ephesus and the dedication of its people to the goddess Artemis. The temple also represented a remarkable combination of architecture and art. Sculptors decorated parts of the structure with detailed carvings that added layers of meaning to the building. These sculptures were not simply decorative, they expressed religious ideas and mythological stories that connected the sanctuary to the wider traditions of Greek culture. In this way, the temple functioned as both a sacred space and a gallery of artistic craftsmanship. Travelers who walked among its columns could admire not only the size of the building, but also the skill displayed in its carvings and architectural details. Another reason the Temple of Artemis became a wonder was the long history behind it. The sanctuary did not appear suddenly as a single construction project. Instead, it developed over many centuries as generations of people returned to the same sacred ground to worship the goddess. Earlier temples had stood at the site before the great marble structure was built. When the temple was destroyed by fire in the 4th century BCE, the people of Ephesus chose to rebuild it on an even grander scale. This continuity of devotion gave the sanctuary a sense of deep historical importance. Visitors knew that they were not simply seeing a new building but standing at a location that had been sacred for generations. The temple's influence also extended far beyond the city itself. Pilgrims, merchants, and travelers from many regions visited Ephesus, carrying stories of the sanctuary back to their own communities. Through these journeys, the reputation of the temple spread across the Mediterranean world. Writers included it in poems and historical works, describing it as one of the most impressive monuments ever created. When later authors compiled lists of the greatest wonders, the Temple of Artemis naturally appeared among them because its fame had already been established through centuries of admiration. For the people of Ephesus, however, the temple meant more than architectural achievement. It represented the bond between their community and the goddess they believed protected them. The immense scale of the sanctuary reflected the depth of that devotion. The temple stood not only as a monument of stone but also as a symbol of belief shared across generations. In this way, the wonder of the temple was not limited to its columns or sculptures. It was also found in the human effort and faith that had created it. As historians and archaeologists continue to study the Temple of Artemis, the monument offers more than just the story of a remarkable building. It also reveals something about the societies that created it. Ancient monuments often reflect the values and priorities of the communities that built them, and the sanctuary at Ephesus is no exception. When the people of the city invested their resources, labor, and artistic talent into the construction of such a temple, they were expressing what they believed was important. The temple represented devotion to a goddess, but it also reflected a desire to create something lasting that could be seen and admired by future generations. One lesson that emerges from the history of the temple is the close relationship between religion and civic life in the ancient world. In modern societies, religious buildings often exist separately from the political and economic activities of a city. In Ephesus, however, the sanctuary of Artemis was deeply connected to nearly every aspect of life. Festivals held in honor of the goddess brought people together in celebration. Pilgrims traveled long distances to visit the temple, contributing to the city's reputation and economic activity. Merchants, craftsmen, and travelers all became part of the network that surrounded the sanctuary. The temple, therefore, functioned not only as a place of worship, but also as a center that linked spiritual traditions with everyday life. The temple also demonstrates how architecture can serve as a form of communication across cultures. Travelers who arrived in Ephesus did not need to share the same language or religious beliefs as the inhabitants of the city in order to appreciate the structure before them. The towering marble columns, the carefully arranged proportions of the building, and the intricate sculptures all communicated a message about the skill and ambition of the people who had built it. Architecture has the ability to express ideas without words, and the Temple of Artemis conveyed the message that the community which created it possessed both artistic mastery and deep devotion. Another lesson comes from the long and complex history of the temple itself. The sanctuary was not static. It changed over time as the world around it evolved. It was destroyed and rebuilt, admired and eventually abandoned. Environmental changes altered the landscape, political shifts affected the city that supported it, and new religious traditions gradually transformed the cultural environment in which it existed. These developments remind us that even the greatest monuments are part of larger historical processes. Buildings that appear permanent can still be shaped by the forces of time, nature, and human decisions. The rediscovery of the temple in the 19th century also highlights the importance of archaeology in understanding the past. Without the work of scholars who carefully studied ancient texts and conducted excavations, much of what we know about the Temple of Artemis might have remained uncertain. The fragments uncovered at the site, combined with written descriptions from ancient authors, allow historians to reconstruct the story of a monument that had nearly disappeared from view. In this way, archaeology helps bridge the gap between the ancient world and the present, revealing how earlier civilizations lived, believed, and created. Today, when visitors stand near the quiet remains of the temple site, the contrast between the present landscape and the ancient descriptions can feel striking. The marshy plain and scattered stones do not immediately suggest the presence of one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Yet the historical record reminds us that the place once held a structure admired across an entire civilization. The silence of the site invites reflection on how human achievements can fade physically while continuing to exist in memory and history. Perhaps this is one of the most enduring lessons of the Temple of Artemis. The monument itself may have vanished, but the ideas behind it, creativity, devotion, cooperation, and the desire to build something meaningful remain part of the human story. Ancient builders worked for years to raise a sanctuary they believed would honor their goddess and bring pride to their city. Centuries later, historians and travelers still remember what they created. And this leaves us with a quiet question to consider. If a monument once admired across the ancient world can almost disappear from the landscape, surviving mainly through fragments and stories, what other wonders of human history may have existed only to fade before their stories could be fully told? As the story of the Temple of Artemis slowly comes to an end, what remains is not only the memory of a remarkable building, but also a reflection on the people who created it. Across many centuries, countless individuals contributed to the life of the sanctuary. Stonecutters shaped the marble columns. Architects planned the structure with careful attention to balance and proportion. Sculptors carved scenes into the stone that expressed the stories and beliefs of their culture. Priests and priestesses maintained the rituals that connected the community to the goddess they worshipped. Pilgrims traveled long distances to stand within the sanctuary, bringing offerings and prayers. Each of these actions formed part of a larger human effort that transformed a simple, sacred site into one of the most admired monuments of the ancient world. The Temple of Artemis reminds us that great achievements in history are rarely the work of a single moment or a single individual. Instead, they emerge from cooperation across generations. The sanctuary grew gradually from earlier places of worship, developed into a monumental temple supported by rulers and citizens, and then continued to evolve through rebuilding and restoration. Even after its destruction, the memory of the temple remained alive through the writings of historians, poets, and travelers who described its beauty. Their words allowed the story of the sanctuary to survive long after the marble structure itself had fallen into ruin. There is also an important lesson in the way the temple eventually disappeared. The builders who raised its columns may have believed that their work would stand forever. Yet time changes landscapes, societies, and beliefs. Rivers shift their courses, cities rise and decline, and new traditions reshape the cultures that inherit the past. The Temple of Artemis experienced each of these forces. Environmental change altered the harbor of Ephesus. Political instability affected the region. Religious traditions evolved, gradually transforming the cultural world that had once sustained the sanctuary. Over centuries, these changes slowly erased the physical presence of the temple from the landscape. Yet disappearance does not always mean loss. The rediscovery of the temple's remains by archaeologists in the 19th century showed that traces of the past can survive in unexpected ways. Foundations buried beneath soil, fragments of sculpted marble, and descriptions preserved in ancient texts all contribute to our understanding of what once existed. Through careful study, historians can reconstruct the outlines of a monument that inspired admiration more than 2,000 years ago. The Temple of Artemis, therefore, continues to exist in another form, not as a complete building of marble columns, but as a story that connects modern observers with the achievements of ancient civilizations. For listeners reflecting on this story today, the temple offers a quiet reminder about the relationship between human ambition and time. The people of Ephesus built their sanctuary to honor a goddess they believed protected their city. They invested enormous effort and resources into creating something beautiful, meaningful, and enduring. Even though the physical structure eventually disappeared, the intention behind it, the desire to create something worthy of admiration, remains recognizable to people across cultures and centuries. In this sense, the Temple of Artemis represents more than a lost wonder of architecture. It represents the human impulse to build, to create, and to leave something behind that speaks to future generations. Ancient builders may never have imagined that their work would still be discussed thousands of years later, long after the marble columns had fallen and the sanctuary had become quiet ground on the plain near Ephesus. Yet their effort succeeded in a different way. The temple continues to live in the shared memory of history. And so the story returns to the question that has guided this journey from the beginning. The Temple of Artemis was once counted among the greatest wonders of the ancient world, not only because of its size or beauty, but because it represented the combined devotion, skill, and imagination of an entire community across many generations. But as we consider the ruins that remain today and the stories that preserve its memory, another question gently remains. If a monument built with such care and admiration could fade so completely from the world it once dominated, what does that reveal about the way human history remembers its greatest achievements?